General Hospital will reveal during a time of tremendous upheaval in Port Charles. As long-buried secrets clawed their way to the surface and fractured relationships were tested to their breaking point. The sudden and unexpected return of Micheal sent shockwaves throughout the entire town. His reappearance wasn't just a homecoming, it was a resurrection of faith. A glimmer of redemption for a family shattered by betrayal, grief, and absence. Yet as the Corinthos family struggled to process Micheal's return and what it meant for their broken legacy, an even greater storm was brewing. The true thunderclap that cracked the emotional sky over Port Charles came in the form of Morgan, the son believed lost forever. The name whispered in mourning and buried under the rubble of memory. His re-emergence was not a fantasy conjured by dream or delusion, it was real, unrelenting, and staggering in its emotional weight. One moment, Jason stood in the dim solitude of night, phone in hand, confusion lining his face. The next, the unmistakable voice of Morgan shattered the silence, not just confirming the unthinkable, but dragging Jason, and soon, the entire town, into a new and almost incomprehensible reality. Morgan's return was not born of fortune or miracle, but of sheer endurance, pain, and the kind of trauma that few ever survive. Years ago, after the devastating explosion that was thought to have killed him, Morgan had not died, but had instead been swept away by the shadowy hands of an international crime syndicate. Unbeknownst to his family, he had become a pawn in a calculated, brutal game, a hostage used to blackmail Sonny and manipulate Jason into compliance with covert missions cloaked in corruption and blood. When those machinations collapsed, Morgan didn't find freedom. Instead, he was buried even deeper, imprisoned within a secret compound somewhere in the depths of Eastern Europe. There, stripped of his identity and force-fed a regimen of experimental drugs, he was reduced to a husk of himself. His memory was fractured, a puzzle of scattered images and names, Carly's touch, Micheal's laughter, the sound of the wind near the docks, all fleeting, all out of reach. For years, Morgan existed in a limbo of confusion and pain, uncertain whether he was alive or merely dreaming of being alive. He was not merely lost, he had been erased, rewritten by the very people who sought to control him. And yet, within the numb fog of amnesia and manipulation, something primal endured. A flicker of recognition. A name. A face. A fragment of a life once lived in a town beside a river, full of love, heartbreak, and fire. That flicker became a flame, and that flame became an inferno. He began to resist, to question, to remember. He studied the guards' routines, hoarded scraps of knowledge, pieced together shards of his shattered identity until the fog lifted enough for him to plan an escape. And when the moment came, he ran, not just from the compound, but from years of captivity, from the psychological prison that had been constructed around him. Morgan's journey home was as perilous as it was emotional. He traveled across countries, bleeding and broken, evading pursuers who were desperate to reclaim their lost asset. He reached out to Jason because somewhere deep within, he knew Jason would come. He didn't know how long he had been gone, didn't know how much the world had changed. But he knew that if anyone would recognize the truth beneath the scars, it was Jason. And Jason did. The call in the dead of night wasn't just a lifeline, it was a reckoning. A seismic shift in a narrative that had grown too used to mourning and moving on. When Morgan returned, he didn't arrive with fanfare or celebration. He stood quietly in the threshold of the Corinthos estate, bruised, leaner, older, but unmistakably him. The moment Carly laid eyes on him, time fractured. Her knees buckled beneath the weight of disbelief and hope colliding in one overwhelming surge. For her, this was not just the return of a son, it was the revival of her soul. Sonny stood frozen. Decades of guilt crashing down on him, knowing that the decisions he had made, the enemies he had provoked, had stolen his son's life. Micheal, overwhelmed and reeling from his own return, now had to grapple with the presence of a brother he had grieved and tried so desperately to let go of. But Morgan wasn't just back, he was changed. The years had carved deeper lines into his psyche. He had been a reckless young man once, driven by impulse and rage, always living in the shadows of Sonny's legacy and Michael's stability. Now, he was something else entirely. Hardened by suffering, sharpened by survival, and carrying a burden of secrets that could destabilize what little peace remained in Port Charles. His mind, still fragile, still tormented by nightmares and foggy memories, became a vault of information, names, faces, networks, that posed a direct threat to the very organization that once imprisoned him. And he knew it. Morgan's return was not merely a personal resurrection, it was a tactical move. He was ready to burn the empire that had tried to erase him to the ground. As whispers spread across town, speculation ignited. Was it truly Morgan? Could someone survive so long in silence and then return to face a world that had changed in his absence? Ava, once haunted by guilt, found herself spiraling at the thought that the man whose life she had helped unravel now walked among them again. Kiki, long torn between love and heartbreak, was shaken by the idea that the love she lost had never truly been gone. And as for Jason, he had found his purpose again. Protecting Morgan, helping him find his footing. Shielding him from the predators now hunting the man who had become a living, breathing liability to a global criminal operation. For Carly, Morgan's return was both a miracle and a wound torn open anew. Every glance at him reminded her of what was stolen, and every word he spoke made clear that the road to healing would not be simple. He carried pain like a second skin, and rage like an ember beneath the surface. Yet despite it all, he was home. And with him came a reckoning, a storm long overdue, ready to rip through Port Charles and leave no lie unturned. When Michael returned to Port Charles, it was as if Carly's heart, fractured for so long by grief and betrayal, began to slowly knit itself back together. The sight of her eldest son alive, safe, and standing before her felt like a miracle, one she barely dared to believe. Even as she embraced him with trembling arms. His homecoming brought with it the promise of healing, a breath of hope in a house long consumed by mourning. And yet, nothing could have prepared her for what came next. Because just when she thought the universe had given her more than she deserved, fate delivered something even more unfathomable, Morgan. The moment Carly laid eyes on both of her sons, standing side by side, flesh and blood, alive, it was as though time folded in on itself. Her scream, raw and unfiltered, echoed through the Corinthos estate like the cry of a soul being returned to wholeness after years of being shattered. It was a collision of emotion that transcended language. Her tears fell freely. Not from sadness but from the overwhelming force of joy colliding with disbelief. The pain of Morgan's presumed death had carved a canyon through her soul, and now, against all logic, against every brutal truth she had been forced to accept, that void was being filled. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her as her two sons stood there, both changed. Both haunted by separate journeys through darkness, but both hers, fully, completely, miraculously. Jason stood nearby, silent, his chest heavy with the weight of memory. For years, he had carried the guilt of losing Morgan like a cross, believing he had failed the young man in the moments that mattered most. Now, in a twist no one could have predicted, Morgan looked him in the eye, not with resentment, not with bitterness, but with forgiveness. That silent exchange between them was more than a reconciliation. It was a balm for years of buried guilt and unspeakable grief. And for Michael, who had grown accustomed to loss, who had spent years being the stable one, the responsible one, the son who survived while others slipped away, Morgan's return was as exhilarating as it was unsettling. Because Morgan, always the wildfire to Michael's steady flame, had returned not as a ghost, but as a man forged in trauma, unpredictable and full of truths no one else could claim to understand. But this was not the same Morgan they had buried in their hearts. The boy who once ricocheted through life with emotional volatility and passion had been replaced by a man molded by pain, sharpened by captivity, and armored in silence. The years of imprisonment had left visible and invisible scars. He spoke less, his movements more calculated, his eyes darker but no less alive. Every glance was a reminder that he had survived the unimaginable. Port Charles was the same in name but different in reality, and Morgan had to re-enter a world that had moved on without him. His return wasn't just an emotional storm, it was a seismic event. Sonny, a man long accustomed to burying pain beneath control and power, was forced to confront the weight of his past. For the first time, he had to look his son in the eye and reckon with the chain reaction of decisions that led to Morgan's disappearance. There were no words sufficient to cleanse that guilt. Carly, despite the euphoria of reunion, wrestled with a lingering fear that this too might be taken away, that it was all just a fragile dream she would soon awaken from. The rawness of her joy was inseparable from the trauma of believing, for so long, that she had lost him forever. But Morgan had not returned for peace or closure. He came back carrying a burden heavier than any of them could imagine. The fragmented memories he managed to recover while in captivity pointed to something deeper, an intricate web of enemies that had not only tried to erase him but were now expanding their influence rig. Beneath Port Charles's nose. He remembered faces, conversations, names whispered in foreign tongues, clues that pointed to an underground resurgence of Sonny's old enemies. These were not vague threats or speculative fears, they were real, organized, and dangerously close. And Morgan, by surviving them, had unwittingly become the key to bringing them down. As he tried to reintegrate into a life he no longer fully recognized, Morgan faced an even more difficult question: where did he belong in a family that had reassembled itself in his absence? Carly and Sonny had shifted. Micheal had grown into a man. Jocelyn was no longer a child. Everyone had evolved. And Morgan had to carve out a space for himself without unraveling the tenuous peace that had settled in his absence. But that peace was already showing signs of strain. Old romances, long buried under the weight of time and assumed death, reignited in unexpected ways. Ava, once entangled in Morgan's reckless love and the chaos it brought, couldn't contain the wave of emotion that crashed over her at the news he was alive. Regret, curiosity, and unresolved feelings surfaced, threatening to pull her into a past she tried so hard to escape. Kiki, who had once believed Morgan was her soulmate, now stood at a painful crossroads. She had built a life without him. Tried to heal from his loss, but the return of someone you once loved deeply doesn't always bring comfort, it can also shatter the fragile peace you worked so hard to construct. And Micheal, despite his relief and joy, couldn't silence the subtle fear that had begun to creep in. Morgan had always commanded attention. He had always drawn people toward him, chaotically, passionately, sometimes destructively. And now, in his return, people were once again gravitating toward him. Morgan, in all his broken brilliance, was becoming the symbol of resurrection. The embodiment of second chances and redemption. And Micheal, the brother who had always held everything together, couldn't help but wonder if he would once again fade into the background of Morgan's orbit. The bond between the brothers, once close and competitive, now simmered with unspoken tension. Their shared blood connected them, but their paths had diverged so drastically that it was hard to know if they could truly find each other again. Beneath the warm smiles and emotional embraces, a quiet rivalry began to stir, one not born of resentment, but of displacement. Port Charles had been Micheal's to protect, to fix, in Morgan's absence. But now that Morgan had returned, the town's attention was shifting, its narrative rewriting itself in real time. And in that silent shift, both men began to feel the pull of identities they no longer fully recognized. Morgan's return, so long hoped for, was not the ending of a tragedy, it was the beginning of a reckoning. It forced every person in his orbit to confront who they had become without him, and who they would need to be now that he was back. Port Charles would never be the same again, because Morgan wasn't just a son come home, he was a survivor, a witness, a catalyst. And his presence would reshape everything that came after. From the very moment Morgan stepped back into the world of Port Charles, everything seemed to shift, almost as though the very heartbeat of the town faltered for a second, then resumed with a new and unrelenting rhythm. His return did not simply mark the homecoming of a long-lost son, it served as a catalyst, unraveling a tapestry of secrets, guilt, and buried truths that had lain dormant for far too long. His presence sent shockwaves rippling through every corner of the community, awakening old wounds, reigniting long-cold fires, and thrusting everyone connected to the Corinthos family into a future they could no longer predict or control. Jason, once the unshakable right hand of Sonny, found himself in unfamiliar territory. His loyalty had always been steadfast, but now it was tested in ways it never had been before. Where once he had protected Morgan as a troubled younger brother, now he stood beside a man forged in isolation and suffering, a man with his own mission, his own agenda, and his own shadows. Their bond was no longer about guidance and protection. It had evolved into a partnership. Together, they carried the weight of what Morgan had endured and the responsibility of what was to come. Morgan wasn't just a victim to be shielded, he was a soldier rising from captivity, armed with dangerous knowledge and a purpose that might destroy what little stability still existed in Port Charles. Sonny, who had built his legacy on power and control, now stood at the precipice of an emotional reckoning. He had survived betrayals, wars, and personal tragedies, always managing to rebuild and reassert his dominance. But nothing had prepared him for this. The return of both Micheal and Morgan, sons who had walked through fire in their own ways, brought with them questions Sonny had no answers for. How do you lead when those you were supposed to protect become survivors of battles you never fought alongside them? How do you hold a family together when your own hands help tear it apart? For the first time, Sonny wasn't the anchor. He was a man struggling to remain grounded as the foundation of his life threatened to fracture beneath the weight of consequence and resurrection. And then there was Carly. Once a grieving mother cloaked in agony and anger, she now became the center of a new gravitational pull, a pillar not just of maternal love, but of emotional strength. The woman who had screamed into the void, begging for answers, now stood as a beacon for two sons who had come back from the brink of oblivion. She had been through hell, had buried her grief in silence, in rage, in resolve, and now she was the only one strong enough to hold the fragile fragments of their family in place. But even she couldn't ignore the uncertainty that wrapped itself around Morgan's return like a fog. He was her son, yes, but he was also something else now. Something unpredictable. Something changed. And that unknown terrified her more than any loss ever had. The call that started it all, whispered across static and darkness, was no ordinary communication. It was a message from the past, breaking through the silence of grief and the assumptions of death. When Jason heard Morgan's voice on the line that night, it did not just stir memory, it broke the laws of reality as they had come to understand it. That single call was like a fuse being lit in a long-dormant powder keg. And as the echoes of that voice traveled through Jason's mind, through Carly's tears, through Sonny's disbelief, it brought with it the undeniable truth that everything was about to change. Morgan's return wasn't accompanied by celebration or parades. It came with storm clouds gathering over the harbor, with the air thick with tension. With the realization that his survival carried implications far beyond personal healing. He returned not as the impetuous, volatile youth that had once chased chaos like a drug, but as a man with layers of pain etched into his bones and a mission buried in the recesses of his mind. He remembered faces. He remembered codes. He remembered whispers behind locked doors, men who had spoken his name like a weapon, organizations that had traded his life as currency. Enemies who had remained hidden while the Corinthos family mourned a ghost. Port Charles could feel it. The town didn't just gain back a son, it inherited a reckoning. Morgan had become a living, breathing consequence. And his presence meant the end of comfortable lies, of silent acceptance. His very existence threatened the balance of power, the truth behind old alliances, and the illusions that had allowed so many to carry on. His gaze, haunted yet unyielding, served as a reminder that not all who are broken remain so, and not all who return do so simply to be embraced. In the days that followed his return, the air in Port Charles seemed to grow heavier. Allies questioned one another with guarded eyes. Old foes began to resurface in hushed tones. Files long thought to be buried came to light, and networks that had worked quietly behind the scenes began to tremble under the weight of exposure. Morgan didn't need to say much. His silence spoke volumes. Every glance, every step he took through the streets of the town he once called home was a declaration. He was not here to be pitied, he was here to remember, to reveal. And perhaps, to burn it all down. Jason moved beside him with wary respect. Torn between wanting to shield Morgan from what he had become and recognizing that Morgan no longer needed protection, he needed purpose. Together, they traced shadows across the docks. Uncovered safehouses long abandoned, and whispered to the ghosts of the city. Carly tried to hold her family together, but deep down, she knew. This wasn't the end of grief, it was a transformation of it. Grief had returned, not in mourning, but in motion, reshaped in the form of a son reborn through fire. And Sonny, the man who once ruled his world with confidence and brutal clarity, found himself kneeling, not before an enemy, but before the magnitude of his own failings. The very sons he had tried so hard to raise as men of strength and honor had now returned as symbols of his deepest regrets and his most terrifying hopes. They were no longer just his boys. They were warriors, survivors, and reminders that the past never stays buried, and the future cannot be controlled. As Morgan stood beneath the dim streetlights of Port Charles, shadows dancing across his face, the town collectively held its breath. He wasn't just a man come home, he was a storm walking on 2 feet. And everyone, friend or foe, would soon have to answer to what came next. Because with Morgan's return came a new war, one where every secret would be dragged into the light, and no one, no matter how powerful, would be able to hide from the past any longer.